The house had learned to breathe without them. This was the first thing Elara understood as she stood in the entrance hall, her coat still buttoned to the throat, her gloved hand resting on the doorframe as though requesting permission to proceed further inward. The air was not stale in the way of neglect. Not quite. It was something else. Compressed, patient, the air of a room that has been holding a thought for a very long time and has learned to hold it quietly without complaint. The dust motes drifted in the still light that fell through the tall, narrow windows beside the door, catching the pale winter afternoon, in slow, aimless drift, suspended between one moment and the next, as though time itself had grown uncertain of its purpose here. She had expected ruin. She had braced herself for it on the train, sitting with her hands folded in her lap and her gaze on the flat, grey countryside passing beyond the window, the inevitable ruin of an empty house, the smell of damp and decay, the rot of window frames, the buckle of plaster. She had prepared for that particular grief, the grief of finding a beloved thing reduced to its materials. She had not prepared for this, the house whole and waiting, still and intact, as though it had simply paused itself on the morning her cousin Margaret locked the door for the last time 11 years ago now, and had not resumed in the intervening years, had simply held its breath and waited. The floors were as she remembered, the wide, dark boards of old oak worn smooth by generations of feet, their surface the colour of deep amber, where the light fell on them, and nearly black in the shadows beneath the staircase. They creaked their old complaints as she stepped forward, a low resonant sound, the house acknowledging her weight, her presence, the fact of her return. The walls rose on either side of the entrance hall in pale plaster, the colour of old cream, and the wainscoting below was painted the same dark green it had always been, a Victorian propriety observed in every room of the house, for as long as Elara could remember, a house that believed in its own dignity, a house that kept its own standards. The furniture was draped in white sheets. She had known this, of course. Margaret had told her when she handed over the keys, had said it simply and without drama, as Margaret always spoke. I put the sheets over everything. Elara, I couldn't bear to leave it otherwise. It felt indecent, somehow, to leave it all naked and staring. And Elara had understood, though she had been 5,000 miles away when Margaret said it. Her telephone warm against her ear, the afternoon light of another city entirely falling through her own windows. She had understood in the abstract, in the practical way one understands a thing that does not yet touch the hands, but the sight of them, the long draped shapes of the sofa, the chairs, the sideboard, the coat rack stripped of its coats, was something that the abstract could not have prepared her for. They were not quite like ghosts. Ghosts were said to be transparent, insubstantial. These shapes were entirely solid, entirely present, and entirely wrong. They were the furniture of memory wearing the wrong clothes. They were too still, too white, too much like something laid out for burial. The silence was a soft blanket over everything. Elara stood in the entrance hall and let it settle around her. She was not a woman given to rushing. She had been, perhaps, in her younger years, had been given to the urgent pace of someone with places to be, things to prove, a life being assembled piece by piece far from here. But that was 60 years of a life and several countries ago, and she had learned in the way of most things, in the slow particular way that learning happens after one has stopped trying to learn. how to be still. She was 81 years old. She had buried her husband, her sister, and most of her friends. She had come back to England from Canada in her 70s, moving to a small flat in Exeter that suited her as an older woman, manageable, quiet, with a good bakery 2 streets over, and a garden she did not have to tend herself. She had come back to England, but she had not come back here, to this house in this particular city, on this particular street, for 37 years. 37 years. The figure moved through her mind without particular urgency, without the drama she might once have assigned to it. It was simply the number. The weight of it was quiet and steady, like the weight of snow. She moved forward, deeper into the hall, her hand trailing along the wainscoting. The painted wood was smooth beneath her gloved fingers. She would take the gloves off soon, she thought, but not quite yet, not before she had moved through the first rooms and found her footing in this place, found a particular version of herself that had once lived here and could navigate these halls with the ease of old knowing. She touched the frame of the door that led to the front sitting room, felt the carved wood beneath her palm, and paused there for a moment, her eyes adjusting to the deeper shadows within. The house held its patient breath. She began in the sitting room because it was the first room and because beginning was the only way to get through a task, and the task was formidable enough that she did not allow herself to think of it whole. She thought of it in pieces. This room, then the next, then the one after, the inventory, the decisions, the long, careful work of determining what could be sold, what would be given, what must be thrown away, and what, perhaps, might be kept. Margaret had told her there was no rush, that the estate solicitor was patient, that the house would not be sold until Elara was ready. But Elara was 81 years old, and had a sharp appreciation for her own mortality, and a corresponding dislike of leaving things undone. She intended to be ready. She crossed to the nearest window and drew back the heavy curtain. It moved reluctantly, stiff with years of hanging in the same position, and a small plume of dust rose from the fabric as she pulled it to one side. The pale winter light came in at an angle, falling across the white draped shapes in the room and illuminating the dust motes that drifted in the still air in long wandering spirals. The light was the particular light of a December afternoon in England, colourless and soft, the light of clouds that have been meaning to snow for several hours and have not quite committed. Through the glass she could see the street below, narrow and largely empty, the pavement white with the morning snow, and the rooftops of the houses opposite catching the last grey brightness of the... She began with the nearest draped shape, the wing-back chair, she thought, or one of them. She lifted the hem of the sheet and drew it upward and back, folding it as she went with the instinct of someone who had spent decades folding things, laundry and letters and maps and the wings of her own disappointments. Beneath the sheet, the chair emerged, upholstered in a dark burgundy velvet that had faded to something closer to rose at the arms and the top of the back, where the light had touched it over many years. She laid her palm flat against the seat. The velvet was cool and slightly soft, the texture of it immediately and entirely familiar, a sensation her hand remembered before her mind could name it, the way certain things live in the body rather than the brain. Her grandmother had sat in this chair. The thought arrived without announcement. without the kind of emotional preparation one is supposed to have for such moments. It simply arrived as memory often did for Elara now, direct, unhurried, certain of its welcome. Her grandmother, Mabel, had sat in this chair on Sunday afternoons, with a book she may or may not have been reading, and a cup of tea that was always too strong. She had sat very straight, because she always sat straight, and she had worn her hair pinned up even in her last years, even when the arthritis in her hands made the pinning a considerable project, because she had standards, and the house had standards, and the two were, in her grandmother's understanding, the same thing. Elara stood beside the chair for a moment, her hands, the dust motes drifted in the still light. The floors creaked their old complaints as she shifted her weight. She continued through the room, sheet by sheet, uncovering what the years had preserved. The sofa in its matching velvet, slightly better condition than the chair. The writing table against the far wall, its surface bare and clean beneath the sheet in a way that surprised her. Some own Margaret, she supposed, had cleared it before sheeting it, had taken away the papers and the pens and the small objects that had always cluttered it, and left only the clean dark wood, the sideboard with its glass, fronted upper cabinet, the glass dusty but unbroken. Inside the cabinet, when she unlocked it with the small key Margaret had included with the house keys, she found 3 shelves of china, the good china, the kind used at Christmas and at Easter, and at the occasions in between that warranted the good china, and at the back of the lower shelf, a small photograph in a silver frame. She lifted the photograph carefully and carried it to the window where the light was better. It was a formal photograph, the kind taken in studios in the early decades of the last century. A woman in a high-collared dress, her hair elaborately arranged, her expression the careful composure of someone aware of posterity and unwilling to appear foolish before it. And yet there was something in the eyes, a particular brightness, the hint of a thought forming, the edge of an expression that had not quite been suppressed. Elara did not know this woman. She turned the photograph over and found, in pencil, barely legible, EMW 1923. The initials meant nothing to her. A great-grandmother, perhaps, or a great-great-aunt, a woman who had sat in that chair, in this house, before Elara's grandmother sat in it. Before Elara herself had sat, small and uncertain, on the edge of the sofa, because she was not allowed to sit in the chair. She set the photograph on the writing table face up. It would need to be identified properly, catalogued. Perhaps her cousin's daughter Julia, who had taken an interest in the family history, would know. In the corner of the room, half hidden behind the fall of an old curtain she had not yet opened, she found a wooden horse on wheels, the paint faded to a ghost of its original red, one ear chipped, the tail a wisp of what might once have been real horsehair, now reduced to a few grey strands. She recognized it, knew it in her hands the moment she picked it up, in the smooth worn wood under her fingers, and the particular balance of it heavier at the head. She had pulled this horse through this house when she was 3 years old, 4 years old, 5. She had named it something she could no longer remember. She set it beside the photograph. These were the things that could not be sold. The dust motes drifted in the still light, patient and unhurried. She made her way through the rooms slowly, Over the course of the afternoon, working in the deliberate way of someone who understands that haste is a form of disrespect to the thing being done, the dining room, with its long table and 8 chairs, its walls panelled in dark wood that had gone nearly black with age, its sideboard heavy and immovable as geological fact, the small study at the back of the ground floor where her grandfather had kept his books. She opened the curtains and stood before the shelves for a long time, reading the spines, finding titles she remembered, and titles she did not, pulling out a volume here and there to check its condition, to open it to a random page and read a sentence or two. The books were in good order. They would need to be assessed properly, perhaps some of the older ones valued before sale. The bookshelf's middle row, pressed between 2 volumes of natural history, she found a flower, a single flower, pressed flat between 2 sheets of paper that had been slipped between the books. A rose, she thought, or what had been a rose, now faded to a pale ochre, its petals brittle as old correspondence, its stem a thin, dark line. She held it up to the light with great care, tilting it gently, watching the paper. Thin petals hold their shape through some miracle of compression and time. Someone had placed this here deliberately. Someone had pressed this flower and tucked it safely among the books, with the intention of keeping it, of coming back for it, and then had not come back. She placed it carefully in the front cover of the nearest book, a volume of collected essays on natural history, thinking that it seemed the appropriate place. The clock ticked from somewhere above. She had noticed it when she came in, that distant steady tick, coming from the upper floor, from the direction of the main bedroom, she thought, where the tall clock that had always stood in the corner of the room had apparently continued its patient work through the years of the house's emptiness. She could not account for this, did not try to clocks, sometimes ran for a very long time without attention, or the clock had its own opinion about time's passage and was keeping it. She moved to the staircase. The stairs creaked as they always had, in the same places and with the same particular voices. The 3rd step with its low groan, the 7th with its sharper protest, the landing with its sustained and contemplative complaint. She had run up these stairs as a child, had been scolded for running on the stairs, had walked them carefully ever after, with the measured tread of someone who has learned that speed is not always the point. She walked them now with the care of age, one hand on the banister, the wood smooth and dark, polished by generations of hands, and felt the house wake slightly around her as she moved, felt it register her ascent. The upper floor held 4 bedrooms and a bathroom with a claw-footed tub that was, she discovered, in considerably better condition than she had expected, the enamel yellowed but uncracked, the taps stiff but functional. She moved through the bedrooms, her parents' room, her grandparents' room with the tall clock that ticked on in steady self-sufficiency, the guest room with its narrow bed still made up under its sheet, as though waiting for a guest who had merely stepped out for the afternoon and might return at any moment, and the small room at the end of the hall that had been hers. She stood in the doorway of her childhood room for a long time without entering. It was as she had left it, or as she had left it inside her memory, which may not have been precisely the same thing. The room was smaller than memory, as rooms always are, the ceiling lower, the window, which she had thought of as vast, a great pane of glass through which the whole world was visible, modest and practical. The bed was sheeted. There was a small chest of drawers also sheeted. The wallpaper. She had not thought of the wallpaper in years. And now it came back to her, with the sudden completeness of things long forgotten and then recovered, small blue flowers on a cream ground, a pattern that repeated itself in a diagonal grid across the walls with botanical exactitude. The paper had faded at the edges of the window and near the ceiling, but it was still there, still its patient blue. She thought she might cry, standing in that doorway. The thought moved through her quietly, recognized and acknowledged, and then passed. She did not cry. She had cried for this house in the intervening decades, in the way one cried for the unreturnable, and had thought herself finished with that particular grief. She found, standing here, that she had been more or less right. What she felt was not grief, but something older and stiller, the feeling of a circle, the sensation of an arc of time bending back toward itself, meeting its own beginning not with collision, but with the gentlest of recognitions. She stepped into the room, crossed to the window, and placed her hand flat against the cold glass. The street below was quiet, the snow undisturbed now that her own footsteps had been covered by the light fall that had begun an hour ago. She stood there for a moment with her hand on the cold glass and let herself be in this room, wholly for the first time in 37 years. Then she went back downstairs, because she had not yet been to her grandmother's parlour. The parlour was at the back of the house, a small room that had always been her grandmother's particular territory. Her grandmother had called it that, the parlour, in a tone that distinguished it entirely from the sitting-room at the front, which was for receiving visitors and maintaining appearances. The parlour was for existing. It was the room where Mabel read in earnest, where she wrote her letters, where she kept the objects that mattered to her most small watercolours she had painted herself. Long ago, a collection of smooth stones gathered from particular beaches over many decades, a small vase of dried lavender replaced each summer. It was not a grand room. It had never been. It was the room where her grandmother was most entirely herself. Elara opened the door with the particular sense of crossing a threshold, not physical, but something else, some threshold of time or of permission, and entered. The room was as the others, white draped, still, the curtains drawn, the air thick with the dust of years, and the particular indefinable smell that old rooms acquire. A smell that was not quite lavender, and not quite old wood, and not quite the memory of fires long extinguished, but something composed of all these things, and none of them precisely. Elara crossed to the window and drew back the curtain in one careful pull. The pale winter light came in. She stood still. On the mantelpiece, in the centre of the narrow mantelpiece above the small, cold hearth, sat a box. She looked at it for a long time without moving. She was not certain how long. The dust motes drifted in the still light. The distant clock ticked its patient count. Her heart was doing something she did not entirely have a name for. Not quite quickening, not quite stopping, something in between. A recognition without object. The mantelpiece had been empty. She was certain of this, or she was nearly certain, and the nearness of her certainty was itself a kind of certainty. She remembered this mantelpiece from hundreds of visits to this room in her childhood. remembered standing before it while her grandmother sat in the chair behind her and talked. And the mantelpiece had held things over the years. A small clock that no longer worked, a pair of candlesticks in green glass, the dried lavender in its narrow vase. But the things had changed as the years changed them, and in her last years here, in the last visits before her own departure, the mantelpiece had been bare. Her grandmother had taken the candlesticks to her sister's house. The lavender had not been replaced. The small clock had been moved somewhere. The mantelpiece had been empty, and yet she moved to it slowly, her footsteps loud in the silence, the floors creaking their old complaints with more emphasis now, as though they too were aware of what was happening. She stopped before the mantelpiece and looked at the box. It was small. She had known it was small from the doorway, but standing before it she understood small more precisely. It was perhaps the length of her outstretched hand, the width of 4 fingers. It was made of dark wood, very dark, polished to a depth that caught the pale winter light and held it. The lid and sides were carved in a pattern of leaves and vines, intricate and fine, the work of someone who had spent a great deal of time on a very small thing, who had believed that the small thing deserved all the time it required. The vines wound around each other in a pattern that repeated without repeating, circling the box in an endless patient spiral. She reached out and picked it up. It was warm. She registered this without alarm, without theatrical response, simply registered it. The warmth in the wood, distinct and unmistakable, a warmth that had no explanation from the cold room around her, the dead hearth at her back, the winter air pressing at the windows. It sat in her gloved hands and was warm, and she turned it over carefully, examining it, feeling the carved pattern through the thin leather of her gloves, with a sudden impatience that made her pull the gloves off and set them on the mantelpiece so that she could hold the box in her bare hands. The warmth transferred directly to her palms, her fingers. It was not the warmth of something artificially heated, not the warmth of a recently held thing or a thing left too long in sunlight. It was a deeper warmth, a warmth that seemed to come from within the wood itself, from the grain of it, the centre of it. She held it for a long moment, her hands absorbing it, the warmth travelling up through her fingers and into her hands and settling there, like something received. The house held its patient breath. She looked at the box's lid. There was a small, simple hinge at the back, and no clasp at the front. Nothing to keep it closed but its own fit and weight. She lifted the lid. The interior was lined with velvet, old velvet, faded from what might once have been a deep blue to a soft, indeterminate grey, the colour of winter sky seen through old glass. The velvet was worn very smooth at the bottom of the box, as though many fingers had touched it over many years, and nested in the centre of this velvet, small and tarnished and entirely itself, was a key. It was an old key, not the key to a modern lock. Nothing machined and precise, but an old key of the kind that belongs to old things, a skeleton key narrow-shafted, with a simple bow at one end and teeth at the other, that spoke of a lock of some antiquity. It was brass, she thought, or had been brass, now tarnished to a deep brown that was almost black at the teeth and the joints, the metal worn smooth at the bow where it had been held by many hands. It was the size of her thumb. Beside the key, tucked carefully against the edge of the velvet in a fold that held it at an angle, as though placed there with deliberate care and not merely set in, was a folded piece of paper. Elara's hands were very steady as she unfolded it. The paper was thin, the kind of writing paper that had once been common and was no longer, ivory, coloured, and slightly translucent, the fold creases sharp but not brittle. She unfolded it once, twice, and smoothed it flat with the back of her hand, and looked at what was written there. The handwriting was her grandmother's. She knew it at once, did not need to deliberate or consider or arrive at her recognition by degrees. She knew it the way she knew the burgundy velvet chair and the creaking stair and the smell of this house, a knowledge that lived in the body, anterior to thought, the particular forward slope of the letters, the firm weight of the strokes, the way the capital letters were made with a decisiveness that brooked no revision. She had seen this handwriting on birthday cards and Christmas letters, and once on a letter written to her after her marriage, a letter she had kept for 40 years and then lost in a move, a loss she still carried with the particular small ache of the irretrievable. She read what was written, for the one who comes back, 5 words. She read them several times, standing before the cold mantelpiece with the box in one hand and the paper in the other, the pale winter light falling across both. She read them until they were not words any more, but simply meaning direct and complete, like a key placed squarely in a palm. For the one who comes back, 5 words in her grandmother's handwriting, on a piece of paper tucked against the velvet of a small carved box, left on an empty mantelpiece in a room that had been empty for 11 years before Elara came back to it. She drew one long, slow breath. The dust motes drifted in the still light. She found the sofa with some instinct, crossed to it without looking, and sat down on its draped edge, the box in her lap, the note still in her hand. The sheet billowed slightly at her movement and settled again. She sat in the hushed white room in the winter light, and let herself be still and let the house's silence come in around her. Let it settle over her like the soft blanket it was, for the one who comes back. She thought about all the years she had not come back. She thought about them without defence, which was the only honest way to think about them. She had been young when she left, 23, just married to James, who was Canadian, and who was going home. And she had gone with him the way one goes with the person one has chosen, wholeheartedly, and with the particular confidence of the young in their own decisions. She had gone to Canada and built a life there, a good life. She believed a life of genuine texture and real love and the ordinary, extraordinary accumulation of decades. She had not been unhappy in Canada. She had not been exile. She had been a person making her life where her life was. But she had not come back. She needed to be honest with herself about the distinction. Sitting here in this room, in this house, she had visited England, had come back to England over the decades, twice for holidays with James, several times in her 60s after he died, the last time for Margaret's sister's funeral 7 years ago. She had been to England, but she had not come here, to this house, to this city, to this street. She had found reasons not to, good reasons, practical reasons. The distance, the expense, the difficulty of travel as she aged, the fact that Margaret was managing things perfectly well and did not need her assistance. All of these were true, and none of them was quite the complete truth, which she examined now with the particular clarity that comes from sitting in a silent house in winter, alone with a box in one's lap, was that she had found it impossible to come back, while the coming back could still mean something that required courage. While her grandmother was alive, coming back had meant seeing her grandmother again, and between herself and that meeting there had always existed, for reasons she had never fully examined and could not entirely name, now a faint, persistent resistance, a hesitation. She had written letters. She had sent gifts. She had telephoned in the later years when telephoning became easier and cheaper, and then simply ordinary. She had meant to visit. She had planned to visit. Her grandmother had died in 1987, while Elara was across the ocean. She had been in Vancouver when the call came from her mother, had stood in her own kitchen with the receiver in her hand and looked out at the garden, a garden she had tended carefully, and which was, that particular April, full of tulips in red and yellow, not knowing that it should have been otherwise, not knowing that grief was a reason to cease blooming. She had stood and listened and had not said much, because she was not a woman who said much in moments of extremity, and after she hung up the phone, she had stood for a long time looking at the tulips until James came in from the garden himself, not knowing, still cheerful with the afternoon, and had seen her face. She had not come to the funeral. There had been reasons. James had just had his first surgery, the minor one, the one that turned out to be the precursor of the major one, and she had not wanted to leave him. And her mother had said it was all right. She understood, and Elara had accepted that understanding and had not come. She had not come back, and now she sat in her grandmother's parlour 7 years after that death, and held in her lap a small warm box with a key inside, and a note that said, in her grandmother's handwriting for the one who comes back, and understood that the note had been written before her grandmother died, written in the knowledge that Elara would eventually return to this house, would eventually come into this parlour, for the one who comes back, not if or her grandmother had believed she would return, had believed it with sufficient certainty to leave this waiting for her, this small gift, this specific and deliberate act of preparation. Mabel had lived to her 92nd year, had died in this house. No, that wasn't right. She had died in the hospital, but she had lived in this house until very near the end, and in that time she had at some point assembled this box and placed it on the mantelpiece, and left it there waiting. Elara looked at the key in the box, small and tarnished, old and smooth at the bow. She picked it up carefully and held it between her thumb and forefinger, turning it in the pale light. An old key, a key to something old. She looked around the room, examined the familiar objects, the fireplace, the window shutters, the small cabinet in the corner, looking for the lock it might belong to, and found nothing. She looked at the box itself, but the box had no lock. She turned the key over once more. She knew, she thought, sitting quietly with the key between her fingers, not in the sense she might have imagined, not some drawer or cabinet or hidden room. The key was not a map to an undiscovered thing. It was the thing itself. It was a key left by a woman who had spent her life in this house and understood, as one understands after years and years of quiet residence in one's own life, that what cannot be opened by ordinary means must be held and not explained for the one who comes back. Her grandmother had known she would carry this, whatever it was. This hesitation, this resistance, this distance had known perhaps that Elara would carry it long after the carrying served any purpose, would carry it past the point of her grandmother's own life, would carry it all the way to this room, and had wanted her to find when she arrived here finally, not a rebuke and not an unanswered question, but a gift, a small, warm, carved thing, and inside it a key that opened nothing but the knowing that she had been expected, that she had been seen, that the waiting had been patient, and the welcome was complete, and that none of it, not the years away, not the missed funeral, not the long, inexplicable distance, none of it had changed what was true, which was simply and entirely that her grandmother had loved her, and had expected her back, and had been right. The tears, when they arrived, were not dramatic. They came quietly, in the way of most things in this house, in the way she suspected her grandmother had preferred tears to arrive, acknowledged and not performed, real and not prolonged. She sat on the edge of the draped sofa, in the pale winter light with the box in her lap, and the key in her hand, and let them come brief and serious, and then let them pass, and sat in the silence of the aftermath, which was a very clean silence, the kind that comes after something has been finished. The dust motes drifted in the still light. The house held its patient breath, and then slowly, gently let it go. She sat for a while longer, not thinking in any particular direction, simply sitting, the box in her hands and the winter light failing by degrees as the afternoon moved toward its end. Then she folded the note, carefully along its original creases, returning it to exactly the shape it had held, and placed it back in the box beside the key, and closed the lid. She held the box in both hands for a moment, feeling the warmth of it, which had not diminished. Then she stood, tucking the box under her arm, and began to move through the house again. She took it with her. This was the only thought she had about the matter. Simple and complete. She took it with her. Room by room, she moved through the upper floor again, the box under her arm, making her notes on the small notepad she had brought, recording what was there, what condition things were in, what decisions needed to be made. The box accompanied her through the process without ceremony, without drawing attention to itself, simply present in the way that the things that matter most are present, undemanding, available, warm. She did not look for a lock the key might fit. She considered it once briefly, as she opened the door of the corner cabinet in the main bedroom, her grandparents' room, where her grandfather had kept his cufflinks and his collar studs, and later, in his last decade, simply the evidence of a life reduced to its essentials. She looked at the small keyhole in the cabinet door, and then looked at the box, and then did not take the key out. Some questions were their own answers. Some things needed to remain the way they were, sealed in their proper meaning, not tested against the wrong lock. The inventory was several hours' work, and she was thorough because she was always thorough, and because being thorough was a form of respect for the task and for the house and for all the people whose lives had accumulated here. She noted the furniture, the condition of the floors and the walls, the books and the china and the silverware in the dining room sideboard, the contents of the linen cupboard on the landing. She noted the photograph with the illegible initials and the wooden horse and the pressed flower in its book. She noted the clock in the main bedroom, a tall clock, mahogany case, Roman numerals on the face, and stood before it for a moment listening to it tick, and thought that if the rest of the furniture went to auction, she would want to keep the clock as well. She worked until the light was nearly gone. When she was done, she stood in the entrance hall again, in the place where she had stood at the beginning of the afternoon, and the house was around her in its full evidence, its white draped furniture and its pale walls and its creaking floors, and the light through the tall windows beside the door was the deep blue-grey of early winter evening. The last of it, the edge of dark. She had replaced the curtains she had opened, all except the ones in her grandmother's parlour. Those she had left pulled back, not sure why. Some instinct about light and the rooms that needed it. The box was in her coat pocket. She had put it there carefully, tucking it in with the same care she would give something breakable and valued. It was not precisely a good fit. The box was slightly too large for the pocket to close over, so the edge of it pressed slightly against her side as she moved, a small persistent pressure. She found she did not mind this. She found she welcomed it, the small reminder. She put her gloves on, both of them, and buttoned her coat to the throat, and turned to the front door. She went back through the entrance hall, past the staircase, to the door of her grandmother's parlour. She stood in the doorway. The room was in deep shadow now, only the pale square of the uncurtained window giving any light, and looked at the mantelpiece, empty as it had always been, as she had remembered it. The box was in her pocket. She looked at the empty mantelpiece for a moment, and thought of her grandmother standing before it, placing the box there, stepping back to look at it as Elara looked at it now. She thought of her grandmother going about her remaining years. However many there had been after that placing she didn't know. In the quiet certainty that it was there, that it was waiting, that eventually someone would come. For the one who comes back, she had come back. She turned away from the parlour and went to the front door and let herself out. The cold hit her at once, clean and direct. The particular cold of a December evening in England that makes itself known without preamble, that enters through the gaps at collar and cuff, and reminds one that warmth is a construction, and winter is a fact. She stood on the top step, and pulled the door shut behind her, and heard the lock click into place. A sound she felt through the key in her hand as much as heard, and stood for a moment with her key and her notepad and the small bulge of the box in her coat pocket. She looked up at the house. It rose before her in the early dark, narrow and tall. Its windows dark now. The houses on either side of it were lit from within. The warm gold of lamp, lit rooms, the occasional movement of a figure behind glass. And the silent house between them was notable in its stillness, its composed darkness, its refusal of spectacle. It looked, she thought, like a house that had finished with something, like a house that had completed a task long held. She stood on the pavement and looked at it, her breath visible in the cold air, rising and dispersing in small, quiet clouds. The snow had been falling softly for some time. She had not quite noticed when it began, and it fell now with the patient, unhurried quality of snow that has settled into its purpose, and will continue without requiring observation. It fell on the pavement around her feet, and on the rooftop of the silent house, and on the dark window sills, and on her shoulders, and on the brim of her hat, gentle and thorough, covering the place where she had come from as she stood, preparing to go. She would come back once more, she thought, probably twice. There was still considerable work to be done. The solicitor, the estate agent, the decisions about the furniture, the books, the china, the particular objects that would need particular handling. She would come back and she would do the work that needed doing, and eventually the house would be sold, and someone else would live in these rooms, and the floors would creak under different feet. This was right, and she knew it was right. She was 81 years old, and she had no use for a Victorian townhouse she could not maintain, and the house itself had no use for continued emptiness, for white sheets and dust, and the long patient waiting of rooms with no one in them. It should have people in it. That was what houses were for. But she would not forget it. She would not forget any of it. The pale winter light falling across the draped shapes of the furniture, the dust motes drifting in the still air, the floors creaking their old complaints, the distant tick of the clock that ran without anyone to wind it, the velvet of the chair that remembered her grandmother's weight, the pressed flower, the wooden horse, the photograph with its unreadable initials and its bright, barely suppressed eyes, and the box warm in the carved darkness of her coat pocket, with its key and its folded note. She would take the box back to her flat in Exeter. She had already decided this, had decided it sitting on the draped sofa in the pale light, had decided it with the same completeness with which she recognized her grandmother's handwriting, a knowledge anterior to deliberation. The box would go on her mantelpiece, the small mantelpiece in her sitting room in the flat, that was hers and suited her, and had good light in the afternoons. It would rest there, dark wood against pale paint, its carved vines and leaves catching the light as they caught the light here. It would be the first thing she saw in the morning when she came through from the kitchen, and the last thing she saw in the evening when she turned off the lamp. It would hold its warmth and its key and its note, and it would be hers, entirely hers. A private thing between herself and a woman she had loved imperfectly and lost too soon, for the one who comes back. She had come back. The snow fell softly on the silent house. She watched it settle on the window sills, fill in the small indentations of the carved stonework above the door, cover the pavement where she had stood for the past several minutes, until her footsteps approaching the house were smoothed over and made indistinguishable from the unbroken white around them. The street was quiet, the few passers-by moving quickly, heads down against the cold. No one looked at the house, no one looked at the elderly woman standing on the pavement looking up at it. She was simply there, and then she turned, and then she was walking, the box warm against her side, and her footsteps leaving their brief marks in the new snow, marks that the snow was already, gently, and without hurry, beginning to cover. The silent house settled behind her as she walked, not with resignation, and not with relief, but with the particular quiet of a thing that has completed what it set out to do. The long, patient, wordless accomplishment of waiting. It had kept its gift safe through the years of its emptiness, through the dust and the dark and the tick of the clock that ran without winding, and the slow, imperceptible settling of old wood in old frames. It had kept faith with a woman long dead, had held her intention intact across decades, had waited for the right pair of hands to open the right door and find their way to the small parlour at the back where the box sat warm on the cold mantelpiece. It had done what was asked of it. The last light faded from the tall, dark windows. The snow fell soft and thorough on the rooftop, on the sills, on the stone steps where she had stood. The house breathed its last breath of the long afternoon's waiting and let it go into the still winter air and settled room by room into the deep and dreamless sleep of something released from its keeping. The silence closed over it like water over a stone, perfect and complete. The silence of a secret well kept, and at last gently given away. The one it had waited for had come. She carried its gift into the gathering dark.